The planet of the Corlins was dying. It wasn't just the seasons that changed or the temperature that rose. Their whole world was crumbling beneath them. Their once thriving oceans had dried up, their cities were crumbling, and the air itself seemed to be choking them. The Corlins were an advanced species, with technology far beyond anything humanity had ever dreamed of, but even their greatest minds couldn't solve the planet's slow death. The clock was ticking, and they had no time left. In their desperate panic, the Corlins turned to the stars. They sent out a signal, a message of distress that echoed across the galaxy. "Please help us. Our planet is dying. We need your assistance." The message was broadcast to every known species in the galaxy, from the farthest reaches to the closest neighbors. They were willing to pay any price, promise any favor, to anyone who would help them. But days passed, then weeks, and still there was no answer. The Corlins had always thought of themselves as superior. For centuries, they had ruled over vast territories in space, establishing colonies, forming alliances, and building an empire that stretched across the stars. They had never needed help from anyone. They were strong, capable, and proud. But now, they realized just how fragile they truly were. They watched as other species in the galaxy received their messages and chose to ignore them. The Corlins knew that their reputation preceded them. They were a proud species, but their reputation was also one of dominance and arrogance. Many species feared them, but they also resented them. Perhaps that was the reason no one was willing to help. Or maybe, just maybe, the Corlins had become too arrogant to understand that they, too, were vulnerable. There were whispers among the Corlins, rumors that other species had seen their situation as an opportunity. Some believed that their enemies would see their planet's demise as a chance to invade, to take over what was left. Others thought that the galaxy's other species simply didn't care. They had their own problems, their own worlds to worry about. Why should they care about the Corlins? A month had passed since the first message went out. The planet's conditions were worsening. The planet's oceans had almost completely evaporated, and dust storms ravaged the once green plains. The Corlins were running out of time, and their leaders were beginning to panic. The survival of their species depended on the intervention of another. Still, there was nothing. The silence was deafening. Finally, when the Corlins were almost ready to give up, another message came through the void of space. It was faint at first, a signal they could barely detect, but it was there. Someone was responding. The Corlins were so desperate that they couldn't help but hope, even if they didn't believe it. They immediately focused all their attention on the incoming signal. It was coming from a small, barely known planet in the distant part of the galaxy, Earth. The message that followed was simple and direct. "We are coming to help." The Corlins were stunned. Earth? How could Earth, a relatively young planet compared to their own, offer help? The Corlins had heard whispers of this species called humans, but they had never taken them seriously. They were just another primitive race, barely scratching the surface of the galaxy. Humans didn't even have faster-than-light travel yet, and their technology was far behind the Corlins. How could they possibly offer any real help? Despite their disbelief, the Corlins had no choice but to hope. They had sent their call out to the stars, and now one species was answering. The humans had heard their distress signal, and against all odds were coming to their aid. The Corlins were skeptical. They didn't believe the humans could do anything that their advanced species couldn't. But what other choice did they have? No one else had responded, and their planet was dying. So they prepared to receive the humans, unsure of what to expect, but willing to give them a chance. At this moment, deep inside the Corlins' hearts, something had begun to change. The proud, arrogant species that had once believed they were the rulers of the stars now realized that they were not invincible. The universe was a much bigger place than they had ever understood, and there were forces out there, even in the smallest, most unexpected corners, that could make all the difference. And so, as they waited for the humans to arrive, the Corlins' hope, though small, was ignited. They didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, they had a chance. A chance they owed to a species they had once overlooked. The Corlands sat in the heart of their dying world, the weight of their failure crushing down on them. The once lush green fields outside their cities were now nothing more than vast deserts of cracked earth. Dust storms swept through their cities like angry ghosts, tearing apart buildings and scattering the last traces of life. The Corlands had always prided themselves on their strength, their advanced technology, and their ability to conquer any challenge. But now, none of that seemed to matter. Their planet was slowly dying, and all their science, all their power, couldn't save it. Weeks had passed since they sent the distress signal across the stars. Every hope they had rested on the belief that someone, anyone, would hear their call and come to their aid. But the silence was deafening. At first, the Corlands had been hopeful. They believed that the message would reach the right ears, that the other species in the galaxy would recognize the danger and rush to help. They thought of the powerful allies they had made over the centuries, the advanced civilizations they had traded with, and the countless planets they had helped. Surely, someone would step forward. Surely, they would not be left to perish alone. But as the days turned into weeks, their hope began to fade. They watched helplessly as their planet's once thriving oceans continued to shrink, and the sky turned an angry shade of red. The crops that had once fed them with ease now withered in the dry soil. The Corlands leaders gathered in emergency meetings, their faces grim with the realization that they were truly alone. "Where are they?" one of the leaders asked bitterly, his voice filled with frustration. "The other species, they've seen our message. Why haven't they answered?" Another leader, an older Corlands with deep lines carved into his face, shook his head. "We have always been the strongest, the most powerful. Perhaps they think we do not need their help." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear he had tried to hide. "Perhaps they think we deserve this fate." It was a harsh truth, but a truth nonetheless. The Corlands had always been a species that valued strength above all else. They had conquered and dominated others, forcing weaker civilizations to bow before them. They had made enemies along the way. And now, those enemies might be silently watching as they struggled. Some species might even be hoping for their downfall. The Corlands couldn't know for sure, but the silence from the galaxy felt like a cold slap in the face. Days passed. Then, a week. The Corlands leaders gathered again, their faces tired and drawn. Still, no one had answered their call. No help had arrived. The message had been sent to every corner of the galaxy, but the silence persisted. The Corlands couldn't understand it. They had always been at the top, the rulers of the stars. And now, they were nothing. "Perhaps we were wrong." One of the younger Corlands spoke up, his voice quiet but filled with doubt. "Maybe we have underestimated our place in the universe. Maybe we are not as important as we once thought." The older leader's face hardened, but he said nothing. He too felt the sting of those words. The Corlands had spent centuries believing they were untouchable, invincible. Now their arrogance had come crashing down, and with it, their hopes. As they waited for a response, the Corlands began to turn on each other. Blame was cast from one leader to the next. Some argued that they had made too many enemies. Others claimed they hadn't tried hard enough to form alliances with the right species. But no matter how many times they debated, no answers came. The Corlands society, once so proud and sure of itself, was falling apart. People began to lose faith in their leaders. They started to question everything. The unity that had once bound them together was fraying, and fear began to spread through their ranks like wildfire. Fear of the unknown, fear of extinction, and fear of being forgotten. One day, a Corland scout came back from a survey mission, looking shaken. He had been monitoring the surrounding space, checking for any sign of a response. But all he found was more silence. "There's nothing," he reported, his voice heavy with defeat. "Not a single signal, not a single fleet. I've checked every possible channel. The galaxy has turned its back on us." The room fell into a deep, uncomfortable silence. The Corlands couldn't believe it. The universe, vast and full of life, had ignored them. They were truly alone. But in the midst of this despair, one Corlands leader stood up, his face hard with resolve. "We cannot give up. We must keep hoping. We cannot let our species die without a fight." The others nodded, though they had little hope left. And yet, they couldn't give in completely. Not yet. The Corlands held on to that tiny thread of hope, even as the silence around them continued. Deep down, they still believed that someone, somewhere, might hear them. But as the days dragged on, that hope began to feel more and more like a distant dream. And then, just as they were beginning to accept the harsh reality, something unexpected happened. A signal broke through the silence. A faint message, weak but unmistakable. It wasn't from any of the species they knew. It was from a small, insignificant planet, far from the center of the galaxy. It was from Earth. The silence in the Corlands' control room felt like a weight pressing down on them, suffocating every last bit of hope. The news of the faint signal from Earth had shocked them. They had expected nothing. They had been preparing for the inevitable end, the moment when their planet would die, and their species would fade away into the void of space. But now something was different. A tiny thread of hope had been woven into their despair. The message from Earth wasn't strong or clear, but it was unmistakable. It was a signal, a promise. "We are coming to help." The Corlands had never heard of Earth in any meaningful way. They had heard the name, of course, but it was always mentioned in passing, like a place of little importance, a planet full of primitive, unimportant beings. Humans were known to be a young species, barely out of the caves in terms of galactic development. They lacked advanced technology and had no history of space exploration. In fact, they didn't even have faster-than-light travel. So, how could these humans, with their limited capabilities, possibly help the Corlands? It seemed impossible, yet the message was clear. "We are coming." The Corlands were confused. They had ignored Earth for so long. They had never thought to learn much about humans, seeing them as insignificant in the grand scheme of the galaxy. But now, in their moment of desperation, they were their last hope. The leaders of the Corlands gathered once more. The older leader, the one who had spoken of their arrogance, stood in front of the group. His face, lined with age and worry, was set in a grim expression. "They are coming," he said. "We have no choice but to trust them. But what can they possibly do? We have spent years building technology and still cannot save ourselves. Can a race with no real experience possibly offer help?" There was silence in the room. The Corlands didn't know how to answer that. They had always believed in the superiority of their own species, and now they had to face the uncomfortable truth that they might not be as strong as they once thought. Suddenly, a new voice broke through the tension. A younger Corlands, one who had been silent up until now, spoke with determination. "What if they are different? What if they have something we don't? We are desperate. Even if they fail, we have nothing left to lose." The older leader looked at him, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, maybe even fear. But then he nodded slowly. "You're right. We have nothing left to lose. Let us prepare for them. Maybe, just maybe, this will be the answer we need." The Corlands immediately began preparing for the arrival of the humans. Their planet was in ruins, but they had a small chance now, and they were willing to give it everything they had left. The Corlands couldn't ignore the fact that someone was coming, and that someone cared enough to help them. A few days later, the humans arrived. The Corlands had never seen anything like it. The human ships, though small compared to their own massive fleet, were powerful in their own right. They landed on the barren surface of the planet, their technology far simpler than the Corlands' own, but somehow it felt more hopeful. The humans stepped out of their ships. They were just like the Corlands had imagined, small, fragile creatures by comparison, with soft skin and eyes that seemed to hold an endless curiosity. But there was something about them, something that the Corlands couldn't quite place. These humans didn't look afraid. They didn't seem intimidated by the ruins of the Corlan's world. They were focused, determined. One human, a tall man with short brown hair, stepped forward and addressed the Corlans. His voice was calm, but there was strength behind it, a quiet confidence that struck the Corlans in a way they didn't expect. "We've come to help," he said, his eyes scanning the dying world around him. "You're not alone." The Corlans were stunned. There was no hesitation in the human's words. No fear, just a sense of purpose that seemed to echo in the way he spoke. The Corlans didn't know how to react. For so long, they had been the ones offering help, the ones in control, the ones who never asked for assistance. But now, it was them who needed help, and this strange, small species had come to give it. For the first time in weeks, the Corlans felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The humans were here, and they were ready to fight for them. "We don't have much time," the human leader continued, "but we'll do everything we can. Together, we'll find a way to save your planet." The Corlans looked at each other, uncertain. How could they trust these humans? What if this was just a mistake, a foolish hope that would lead to even more disappointment? But deep down, they knew they had no choice. The humans were here. And that was more than anyone else had offered them. Maybe this was their last chance. And so the Corlans, for the first time in their history, found themselves working with a species they had once looked down on. They didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, they dared to believe that something could change. The Corlans stood in stunned silence as the human ships touched down on their dying world. The once grand cities around them were now nothing but shattered remnants of a lost civilization. The air was thick with dust, and the ground seemed to tremble under the weight of what had once been a proud planet. But as the human ships slowly lowered their landing gears to the surface, something new filled the air, a quiet sense of hope. The Corlans had always prided themselves on their advanced technology, on their dominance in the galaxy. They had never needed anyone's help. But here, in this moment, they were faced with the reality that they were no longer the strongest, no longer in control. Their world was dying, and it was the humans, an unknown, primitive species, to offer them the one thing they had lost: hope. The human ships were small compared to the massive Corlans vessels. The Corlans had designed their ships to be imposing, sleek, and powerful, each one a symbol of their superiority. But the human ships, although less impressive in size, carried a different energy. They were simple, efficient, yet filled with a kind of quiet purpose that the Corlans found unsettling. No grand show of power, just a willingness to help. The Corlans watched as the humans stepped out from their ships. They were not what they expected. These humans were not warriors, not conquerors. They wore simple clothes, their faces marked with determination, their eyes filled with a curiosity that could only come from a species still discovering its place in the universe. They were smaller than the Corlans, their bodies fragile-looking in comparison, but there was a fire in their eyes that the Corlans couldn't ignore. A tall human, the one who had spoken before, stepped forward. He looked around, his face a mixture of awe and concern as he took in the ruined landscape of the Corlans' planet. His eyes met the Corlans' leaders, and for a moment, there was no need for words. The human seemed to understand the depth of their loss, the weight of their desperation. "We've come," the human said again, his voice firm and steady, "to help." The Corlans didn't know how to respond. For centuries, they had been the ones to offer aid to others, to control the flow of resources, technology, and knowledge. They had never been on the receiving end of help. And yet here they were, standing before a species that had no reason to offer anything, yet had come anyway. One of the Corlans' younger leaders, still full of skepticism, stepped forward. "You are too late. Our planet is dying. You don't have the power to save us." The human's gaze softened, and he nodded slowly. "I know," he said quietly, "but we don't give up easily, and we never leave anyone behind. We'll try, and that's what matters." There was something in his words, a quiet strength, that caused a shift in the Corlands' hearts. For the first time in weeks, they felt something that resembled trust. They had been alone in their suffering for so long, with no one to turn to, no one to help. But now, there was a chance, however small, that this human species, with all its imperfections, could make a difference. The Corlands' leader, the one who had been the most skeptical of the humans' ability to help, took a deep breath. "Very well," he said. "We'll listen. But you must know this. Our technology is beyond yours. We have nothing left to offer you. Whatever help you give must be enough." The human leader nodded again. "We're not here to compete. We're here to stand with you, to try together. That's all we can do." And so, the humans got to work. It wasn't much to look at. The Corlands had expected grand machines, towering structures, or a fleet of advanced ships capable of reversing the planet's damage. But instead, the humans began with the most basic things: digging wells, planting seeds, and gathering the remains of what was left of the Corlands' technology. They didn't try to fix everything all at once. They didn't promise miracles. They simply began. The Corlands watched in disbelief. The humans worked tirelessly, day and night. They didn't rest, didn't stop. They spoke to the Corlands with a kind of quiet respect, never forcing their ideas on anyone, but offering help when needed. Every small task they completed, from repairing energy sources to rehydrating the soil, gave the Corlands a small flicker of hope. It was clear that the humans had no grand plan to save the Corlands' planet in one swoop. But it was also clear that they had something the Corlands had lost: the ability to care. The humans didn't expect to be rewarded, didn't demand recognition. They just worked, one step at a time, because it was the right thing to do. As the days passed, the Corlands began to understand something they hadn't before. They had always believed that strength came from power and domination. But now, they were seeing something different. Strength could also come from kindness, from the willingness to help without asking for anything in return. The human leader, as he stood watching the work unfold, turned to the Corlands' leader with a small smile. "It's not much, but it's a start." The Corlands could only nod. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign that their planet might survive, that their species might not be lost forever. For the first time in a long time, the Corlands felt something they hadn't in years: hope. And so the Corlands, once so proud and powerful, found themselves standing side by side with the humans, realizing that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from being the strongest, but from being willing to help. Days turned into weeks, and the Corlands began to witness something they had never thought possible. The humans, with their simple tools and humble determination, were slowly turning their dying planet around. The once dry soil was beginning to show signs of life again. The crops, though small at first, began to sprout. Water flowed from the wells the humans had dug, and the energy plants, once broken and useless, flickered back to life. The Corlands watched with growing awe as the impossible seemed to become possible. They had expected the humans to fail. After all, how could a race so young and so inexperienced save a planet as damaged as theirs? Yet, in a way, it was happening. The humans worked quietly, without fanfare. There were no grand speeches or flashy displays of power. They simply worked, fixing, rebuilding, and caring for the planet, as though it were their own. They didn't just focus on the technical aspects of the recovery. They focused on the people, too. They listened when the Corlands spoke of their losses, of their fears. They offered not just solutions but comfort. And slowly, the Corlands began to realize that they had underestimated these humans in every way. One afternoon, as the Corlands gathered to assess the progress, their leader, the one who had once doubted the humans the most, stood in front of a group of Corlands engineers. The humans were there, working side by side with them. But this time, the Corlands were beginning to listen. "I never thought I would see the day," the Corlands leader said, his voice quiet. "I never thought we would recover. But perhaps we have underestimated the humans. Perhaps we have underestimated what is truly possible. The human leader, the same tall man who had spoken to them when they first arrived, stood beside him. "It's not about what's possible," he said, his voice calm. "It's about what's worth trying. And we're not giving up." The Corlans were stunned. In all their years of dominance and superiority, they had never met a species like this. The humans didn't seek glory or recognition. They didn't look for rewards. They just wanted to help, to do the right thing. It was a lesson the Corlans had never learned, and it humbled them. One of the Corlans' engineers, a younger woman who had been watching the humans closely, spoke up. "They are working alongside us as though they are equals. No one has ever treated us like this before." The Corlans' leader nodded slowly. "And that is something we can learn from. We have spent so much time thinking only of our own power, our own strength, that we forgot what it means to truly care for others." The human leader smiled. "We all have something to learn from each other. The strength of a people isn't just in their power or their weapons. It's in their willingness to help, to keep fighting when everything seems lost." As the weeks continued, more and more signs of recovery appeared. The atmosphere, once thick with pollution and the remnants of destruction, started to clear. The once scorched land began to cool, and the winds that had once carried dust storms across the planet now carried the scent of new growth. The Corlans could hardly believe their eyes. The humans had done it. They had started to heal the planet. But it wasn't just the planet that was changing. The Corlans themselves were changing too. They began to work together with the humans, side by side. Where once there had been pride and arrogance, there was now humility. Where once there had been distrust, there was now cooperation. The Corlans had spent so long believing in their own superiority that they had forgotten the importance of working with others. The humans had shown them what true strength really looked like. One day, the Corlans' leader called for a meeting. The human leader joined him, and together they stood before the people of both species. The room was filled with a mixture of Corlans and humans, working together to rebuild what had been lost. "We have made progress," the Corlans' leader began, his voice strong. "But this is only the beginning. We have a long road ahead. The damage to our world is deep, and it will take time to heal fully. But if we continue to work together, if we continue to care for each other, there is nothing we cannot achieve." The human leader stepped forward, his voice steady. "You've shown us that we can do more than we ever thought possible. But it's not about what we can do alone. It's about what we can do together. That's the true power." The room was silent for a moment. And then a wave of applause broke out. The Corlans were not applauding the humans for their skills or their technology. They were applauding the humans for their hearts, for their willingness to give everything they had to help another species, even when there was no reward in sight. The humans had done the impossible, not just by healing the planet, but by healing the Corlans' belief in what was truly possible. In that moment, the Corlans realized that their species was not beyond saving. And perhaps, more importantly, they had realized that strength didn't just come from power. It came from the courage to try, to care, and to help others, no matter the odds. And so, the impossible became possible, not through technology or grand gestures, but through simple acts of kindness, cooperation, and the willingness to believe that something better could be achieved together. The Corlans had started to believe that the worst was behind them. Their planet, once on the brink of destruction, was slowly healing. The crops were growing, the atmosphere was clearing, and the land that had been scorched was showing signs of life again. The humans had worked tirelessly, side by side with the Corlans, to make this miracle happen. For the first time in many years, the Corlans felt a sense of hope. They were no longer alone. They had friends, and those friends were helping them rebuild what had been lost. But just when things seemed to be looking up, something unexpected happened. A massive fleet appeared on the edge of the Corlans star system. The ships were dark and menacing, unlike anything the Corlans had seen before. They were fast, powerful, and intimidating, an unmistakable sign that they were not friendly. The enemy had come. The Corlins scrambled into action, rushing to their defense stations. The humans, who had been working alongside them, immediately recognized the danger. They didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, they joined the Corlins in preparing for battle. The Corlins' ships may have been more advanced, but the humans, with their resourcefulness and determination, had already proved themselves to be more than capable. As the enemy ships drew closer, the Corlins' leader turned to the human commander. "We need your help," he said, his voice tense. "We've never faced a force like this. If they attack, we may not survive." The human commander, the same man who had led them with quiet strength from the beginning, nodded. "We'll fight. We don't leave anyone behind." The Corlins were amazed by the human commander's confidence. They had come to realize that the humans were not just fighters. They were fighters with heart. The Corlins had once believed that strength meant power, weapons, and technology. But now, they understood that true strength came from the will to stand together, no matter the odds. The enemy fleet continued to approach, and the tension in the air grew thicker. The Corlins and humans worked quickly to ready their ships, to form a plan of defense. The enemy ships began to open fire, their weapons lighting up the sky in deadly streaks of light. The first wave of enemy fire struck the Corlins' defense shields, sending shockwaves through their ships. But the Corlins had learned a lot in the past weeks, and the humans had helped them upgrade their technology. The shields held strong, and the ships didn't falter. The Corlins fired back, their weapons lighting up the sky, and the humans joined in, using their own technology to launch missiles and blast enemy ships from the sky. The battle raged on. The Corlins and humans fought side by side, working together as one force. The Corlins' ships were faster and more powerful, but the humans' quick thinking and determination turned the tide in unexpected ways. They had adapted to the situation quickly, finding weak spots in the enemy's defense that the Corlins had missed. It was a brutal, chaotic battle. The enemy fleet was relentless, and every moment seemed to stretch on forever. But the Corlins and humans refused to give up. Together, they held their ground. As the hours passed, the Corlins began to notice something. The enemy ships were starting to break apart. The firepower from the Corlins and humans was beginning to take its toll. The Corlins' leader, who had been watching the battle unfold from his command station, couldn't believe his eyes. They were winning. The human commander's voice crackled over the comms. "We've got this. Push forward." The Corlins, fueled by the determination of their human allies, launched one final strike. The combined force of the Corlins' firepower and the humans' strategic ingenuity overwhelmed the enemy fleet. One by one, enemy ships exploded in fiery bursts, leaving only debris in their wake. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the battle was over. The enemy ships were either destroyed or retreating. The Corlins and humans stood victorious. The Corlins' leader, who had once doubted the humans, now stood in awe. He had never believed that their planet could survive, let alone win a battle like this. But the humans had shown him something he hadn't known. It wasn't just technology that made a difference. It was heart, courage, and the will to fight for something bigger than yourself. The Corlins gathered to celebrate their victory. But the human commander, as always, remained humble. "We did it together," he said simply. "This isn't just a victory for us, or for you. It's a victory for everyone who believes in standing together." The Corlins looked at each other, and for the first time in a long time, they felt something they had never felt before: true gratitude. The humans hadn't just helped them rebuild their planet. They had helped them rediscover what it meant to be strong, to stand tall, and to fight for each other. As the last of the enemy ships retreated into the darkness of space, the Corlins knew one thing for sure: they were no longer alone. They had allies now, humans, who had proven that even in the face of impossible odds, the will to fight together could make all the difference. The enemy had retreated, but the war was far from over. The Corlins and humans knew that the enemy would regroup, and the final battle was approaching. This time, there would be no turning back. The fate of the Corlands planet, and possibly the galaxy, rested in the hands of these two species, united by a bond forged in fire. The Corlands had rebuilt their defenses, and the humans had helped. Together, they had created a powerful force, ready for whatever was coming next. But no one could be sure what that would be. The enemy was relentless, and they would come again, stronger and more prepared. The Corlands leader stood in the command center, staring out at the stars. The dark void of space seemed endless, and in it, the Corlands saw their future. "We've done everything we can," he said, his voice quiet. "Now we wait." The human commander stood beside him. "We don't wait. We prepare, and we fight." The Corlands had learned a lot from the humans in these last weeks. They had seen what true courage looked like. The humans didn't give up, even when things seemed hopeless. They fought not just with weapons, but with heart. And that, the Corlands had realized, was something more powerful than anything the enemy could bring. The enemy fleet soon appeared on the horizon, a massive wall of ships moving toward the Corlands planet. The enemy was here for one final strike, and this time they had come with everything they had. The Corlands could feel the weight of the coming battle, but they stood firm. The humans, standing alongside them, were ready. The final battle began with a roar of energy and fire as the two fleets collided. The sky lit up with explosions, and the sounds of battle echoed across the cosmos. The Corlands ships fired first, their advanced weapons tearing into the enemy ships. But the enemy was relentless, firing back with overwhelming force. It was a fierce, brutal fight. Ships were destroyed, both Corlands and enemy alike. The vastness of space seemed to shrink with every blast of energy, every explosion that lit up the sky. The Corlands ships were fast, but the enemy ships were relentless. And yet, through it all, the humans never stopped fighting. Their ships darted in and out of the fray, launching precise attacks on the enemy's weak points. The human strategy was simple but effective. They didn't just fight to destroy, they fought to win. The Corlands watched in awe as the humans worked together, coordinating their attacks with skill and precision. The human commander's voice came through the comms. "We can't just fight for survival. We fight for victory. For our future." The Corlands leader, who had once doubted the humans, now understood. They weren't just fighting for their planet. They were fighting for each other, for the future of every living being in the galaxy. This wasn't about power. It was about something deeper, something worth protecting. The battle continued, each moment more intense than the last. The Corlands ships fired, and the humans took advantage of every opening they could find. Slowly, but surely, the tide of the battle began to turn. The enemy fleet, once so powerful, began to falter. The Corlands and humans worked in perfect unison, their ships moving together, as if they were one force. And then it happened. The Corlands and humans managed to breach the enemy's main ship. With a final, coordinated strike, they destroyed the heart of the enemy fleet. The massive ship exploded, sending shockwaves through the rest of the enemy forces. One by one, the remaining enemy ships began to retreat, their once strong fleet breaking apart in the face of this unexpected alliance. The Corlands stood in stunned silence as the enemy forces fled, vanishing into the depths of space. The final battle had been won. But the victory wasn't just in the destruction of the enemy. It was in the bond that had been formed between two species who had once seen each other as strangers, even enemies. The Corlands had learned that strength wasn't just in weapons or technology. It was in standing together, in fighting for something more than just survival. The Corlands leader turned to the human commander. "We couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice filled with respect. The human commander smiled, his eyes filled with the same quiet confidence they had seen from the start. "We did it together. That's all that matters." As the debris from the battle floated away, the Corlands realized that they had not only saved their planet, but had gained something even more important. They had gained a new understanding of what it meant to be truly strong, and a lasting friendship that would never break. In the days that followed, the Corlands began to rebuild. But this time, they were not alone. The humans stayed by their side, helping them not only to recover from the war, but to create a future that was better than the past. Together, they worked to heal their planet, and together, they built a new era, one where two species, once strangers, now stood as allies. And the Corlands knew, without a doubt, that they would never forget what the humans had taught them, that the true strength of any people isn't in their power or their technology. It's in their willingness to stand together, no matter the odds.